In my young days, I used to, after school, go out to see where the Dad was. He was log hauling using a team of horses, a log wagon. And I used to follow him home up this track, which runs from the River Pools back up to where the original sawmill used to be. I played a bit with photography in those days, and I did take this particular photo on this track of him walking beside his log team. I climbed up a tree and waited for him to come around a little bit of a bend, and that's when I took the photo. As you can see from this photo, the bush was fairly open in those days. You could walk around in the forest quite comfortably. But as time went on and the control of the forest changed from the Forest Commission to the DNRE, it virtually was let run wild and became that dense that you couldn't tear your way through it in many places. In my younger days, one of my occupations was sort of roaming through the forest looking for wildflowers and orchids, and it's a thing that annoys me today, I might say, that in those days there was an abundance of orchids in the way of spider orchids, sun orchids, hyacinth orchids, green hoods. They were everywhere. Also there was a mass of tea tree, sorry, not tea tree, heath, the red and the pink heath. That existed everywhere, and it was quite a picture to see. But as time went on and the control of the forest changed from the Forest Commission to the national parks, those orchids and those wildflowers are no longer in existence due to the way they manage the forest in actual fact. It is necessary to have light burns to bring your wildflowers and also to germinate your tree seedlings. And they jumped down on that and would not permit any burning, with the result that you have a build-up of dead vegetation. That thick that in many places you can't tear your way through it, and they have created one huge fire hazard that eventually will burn and cause the destruction of a lot of your tree seedlings and also destruction of a lot of your trees. My father was David Hann, and he did the log hauling for the mill with a team of horses, 6 all told, 2 in the shafts and 4 ahead of the shafts. 2 leaders. They responded to commands. They did not have reins, and they used to purely tell them to gee off, which was go to the left, or come here, which was go to the right, and they did so. There was one horse, it was a beautiful old horse, a big black and white horse, who the Dad bought from a Indian hawker who travelled the district in those days. It was a horse that always came to you, never walked away from you. You could hop on its back anywhere, it was quite at home. It did not require reins, it responded to commands. And if I could get one today, I'd still have one. Purely as a pet, not as a farm working horse, but it is a beautiful horse. But he used to do 2 loads of logs from what we know is over the River Pools at the back here into the mill, and he'd do that 6 days a week. All the carting was done during the summertime, during the dry conditions of the year, and they'd build up a log supply to carry the mill through over the winter. So I used to use 3 of the horses for sneaking the logs out. 2 in the front, 2 leaders, and 1 behind. A team of 3 used to snig the logs out. They were pulled out. They used to pick as clear a spot as they could find, pull it out beside the wagon, used 2 skids and 2 rolling up chains. Chains used to were fixed to the bolster of the wagon at the centre of the wagon, and went down under the logs and back over the top of the wagon, and the 3 horses pulled those logs or rolled those logs up onto the wagon. Usually there were 3 logs on the base. There were 2 logs lay on top of that, and a 6th log on top of that again. Normally brought in about 6 logs a load. I'm not able to give you an idea. I think it's about 2,000, what they referred to as 2,000 feet of timber. But I didn't go into that. I was too young to be worried about those sort of things. So when I come out after school to meet the dad, I think one of my fears was that he'd be okay, that he'd be safe, because I realised in those days there was room for accident, and he was out here on his own. I think that was probably one of my biggest worries. And where I used to worry was coming down the hill to the River Pools. It was a bush track, and it used to have logs down the side to stop the wagon from sliding sideways. There were also pretty deep gutters cut in the road, and what used to worry me, to put the brakes on, he had to go in under these logs and wind up the brake on the back wheels. That used to concern me. I used to worry that maybe the axle would break and he'd be under the logs. But fortunately nothing ever happened. I worried unnecessarily. From the Surrey River Pools into the mill site would be roughly pushing 2 miles, I suppose, in old measurement, because you used to get the logs from over the River Pools on the other side. That was the area that was allotted by the Forest Commission. So out of the 6 horses, 5 of them were very good horses, but there was one rogue, and he was always kept in the shafts of the wagon. If you left the harness on, I used to refer to the harness to the back as the breeching. If you left that on him, he was bound to kick it to pieces when he got out. But you always made sure you took it off before you let him out. But he was a bit of a rogue. But the other horses had good temperament, well, they were good horses that way. Horses were always fed. They had a nose bag on them, which had a mixture of chaff and oats, hay and oats, and they were fed night and day. Always fed early in the morning and fed again that night. If they had been working hard, as they did, and were sweaty, they were often washed down, and particularly around the shoulders where the collars fitted, but that's where they would get sore if they weren't looked after properly. But oh no, generally speaking, they were a good horse team. In those days the forest was relatively open. You could walk around in it quite comfortably. You didn't have all this mass of dead vegetation, and you didn't have to tear your way through the majority of places. Now, Tim Hodgetts was a very experienced man, and he always went through, he marked what trees you were permitted to fall, and that was, there was always a blaze put on the tree up, just a piece of bark stripped off so as you could see the tree, and you could see that tree for quite some distance because the forest was very open. And also there was a chip taken out of the butt and the crown was hammered into the butt, and that was the tree you were allowed to take. Once the tree was fallen, it was then cut into lengths required, but you could not touch those lengths until Tim Hodgetts came around again, took the measurements, diameter and length, and he also drove the crown into the end of the log so that you had evidence that it had been recorded and paid for. But Tim's policy was, before the summer every year, to go through the forest and burn all the tree tops, that trees that had been fallen, burn the tops, and he would burn up any build-up of dead vegetation. Anywhere he could burn, he burned it. And because he never permitted it to get dense, he always got a light fire. And he never had a fire get away on him. And as a result of that, we used to get a lot of growth. We used to get our orchids, we used to get our wildflowers. And we never had the fire risk that we have today, by any means. Tim Hodgetts had the ability to sound a tree and that is go up to the tree with the axe and drive it hard into the side of the tree, and from the sound you can tell if it's a sound tree right through. You can tell if it's got a dull sound, you know there's possibly a pipe of wet rot in the centre, or maybe there's white ants in it. And you can also tell, he could also tell by looking at the tree. If there was a lump up the side of the tree, a bump up the side of the tree, it was a pretty sure thing there were white ants in that tree. And if he went up further into the limbs and saw a dead limb, he knew that tree was on the way out. It was starting to die. And in all possibility, there was either a hollow in the tree or a pipe down the centre of the tree. And he would mark that tree so that you could fall it and get whatever value was in it. Today's policy is no, you mustn't touch that tree, it might have a mouse in it or something. But no, they managed the forest. They really managed and farmed the forest correctly. I'm very fond of forest. I like the forest, and I like trees, and I like to see it managed properly. As a matter of fact, on our own land, I kept an area of forest. One, because I like having some forest, and two, because I foresaw the need for timber, posts, and firewood. And I still have that forest today. Yeah, with the sawmill, the two older brothers run the sawmill. That is Ern and Bill. And they had 2 or 3 employees as required. Yes, one was George Moore. He was the main man. There was Gil Bryant, and also Ted Sutton, who was a relative of Gil Bryant's. The 3 of those did work with Bill and Ern on that mill site. Most of the timber, a lot of the timber was used locally, but the bulk of the timber went to Port Fairy to the firm of J.J. McLaren, who was a builder and run a hardware store in Port Fairy. But regularly, 2 to 3 times a week, loads of timber were forwarded over to Port Fairy. So there's a heck of a lot of houses around Port Fairy have our timber in them. But that all came to an end when the war started. Bill was the main benchman. One of the other men usually tailed out, and there was always a man on the rollers and the gauge operating. They took it in turn to break down, but Bill was the main benchman. He only ever had one accident in his day. He did run his hand onto the saw, and he got a very severe cut between the thumb and the first finger. But he saved the finger all right, and it was okay afterwards. But that was the only accident we ever had. The sawmill that the Dad run was powered with a suction gas engine. It was a Russel and Hornsby suction gas. I couldn't tell you the horsepower of it, but it was I know the piston had a diameter of around 20 inches. That's about 1'8", and the flywheel on that engine was around the 8 foot in diameter and had about a foot face on it. I don't know the power of it, but I do know that they used the offcuts and the waste timber from the mill that was burnt in a pit, and when it reached a good charcoal stage it was doused with water and put out, and then it was bagged, and those bags of charcoal were then fed into it was a producer, I think was the correct term to use for it. It's like a small furnace, fire bricked and so forth. I don't from memory remember just how many bags a day, but it was a very economical engine. That mill, when it closed down, it closed down when the war started, and both Ern and I went into the Air Force. When we returned, Ern then took over running the mill. He shifted it from its original site down to where he lived, which was down the road about 1.5 miles, I suppose, something like that. He worked on it for several years. I worked with him there, and I learned the art of benching and working saws, doing saws and so forth. Incidentally, he used to hammer his own saws, which is something there was nobody else in the area able to do. I rather foolishly didn't learn to do it, but I did hold the saws for him while he did it, and I do know the principle of doing it. He unfortunately, only a few years after the end of the war, he became very ill. They put it down to war causes, and he finally died. But prior to that, he hired the mill to, firstly to Tommy Herbertson, who ran it for a couple of years, and then from there it went to George Thomas. George Thomas shifted the mill again down to the site that Ponting Brothers from Warrnambool had. They took that mill over from George Thomas. They got rid of the suction gas engine, they went into power, and then they went into a fully automatic job, from manual to fully automatic. In the case of actually working on a saw bench, it's a specialist job, whether you're benching or whether you're tailing out or whether you're breaking down. In breaking down a log, you have to firstly know what you want. If you want wide beams, such as 8x2s, or in today's language it'd be 200 by 50, or you want a board 6x1, you always took the side of the log off centre. When you put it on the breaking down truck, you took the side off. If you wanted 4x2s, 4x3s, that type of timber, you split the log down the centre. There was a reason in that, because when it got over to the rip bench, you would, if you're cutting wide boards, you'd have the narrow piece, you'd lay that on the flat, you'd take one edge off it, and then you'd take, say, an 8-inch centre out, and you may get 2 or 3 beams out of that side. And then when you got onto the big side of the log, once again you'd do the same thing. If you were, say, cutting an 8x2s out of it, you'd take the side off approximately 4 inches from the centre, and then you'd slip it over onto the gauge, and you'd take an 8-inch beam out of the centre of that log. One of the reasons for doing that is you had to cater with spring in the timber. When you took one side off, the tendency for that tree was to bow. But when you took the other side off, it would bow back again, and you'd finish up with 2 straight sides. There was an art in doing it. You had to know the timber, what you wanted, and you had to visualise it in advance as to how much to take. Quite often you could also quarter cut timber. You take the half of the log after it's been broken down on the breaking down bench, and you'd run it into, say, if you wanted 2-inch stuff, you'd run it into 2-inch slabs. Start on the outside and take all 2-inch slabs, and then you'd redo those slabs, and because of the bowing, the initial bowing when you broke it down, you may have to initially face one side of that slab to get it straight. Then you'd run it out to whatever you wanted, whether it be 4x2s or 6x2s or 8x2s. You'd take it out and you'd have 2 straight sides. But there was an art in doing it, and there was an art in tailing out. The tailer out, he had to keep that timber running on the bench. You had to part the 2 pieces as they come over the saw and apply a little bit of pressure to the outside one to maintain it on the saw, on the bench, and also on the saw. Now, the vital thing about rip benches is you must have a guard up from the back of the saw up to the top of the saw, and have a guard over the top of the saw. Because if by any chance your tailer out had a piece of wood slip out of his hand, and if it caught on the top of the saw, that saw can grab it and spear it straight forward through to the benchman. There was a benchman, Mr. Rube Cook, I only knew him as Mr. Cook in those days because he emceed the dances, and I used to go to a lot of dances. But he had a shield over one eye because he had a piece of wood spear off the saw and hit him in the eye. Benchman had to be, the actual benchman had to be always on his guard and watch for the possibility that the tailor out could let a piece of wood slip. Not purposely, accidentally. He was really in a dangerous position, and he had to always be on guard for that. But each man had his job, and he had to know it. And there was something that he had to know about, whether he was benching or tailing out or breaking down. Yeah, well, I learned to bench, and as I said, you had to know what you were going to cut and what you wanted.